Oh, hey, this week in the shop, I'm actually gonna build a piece of furniture. Remember when I used to do that all the time? I know, it's been a while. We need a dining room table for the cabin, so that's what I'm gonna be working on. I went to a local salvage yard and I found some really cool old Douglas fir. Now, fir can be a little tricky to build with, especially reclaimed fir, because it likes to turn orange. And nobody likes an orange table. So we're gonna peel back the old layers of this. We're gonna try our hardest not to make it orange. I got some tricks up my sleeve for that, so stay tuned. And we're gonna try and build a cool, rustic looking dining room table. I hope. So follow along, check the video description for links to products, the Bourbon Blade, Patreon, all that stuff. Let's get to work. I might need to go get Craig. I got a mixed bag of wood from the salvage yard. I got these really long true 2x14s, which means they're actually 2 inches by 14 inches. And then I got these 3x4s, which is kind of a weird dimension, but I thought they would make pretty good table legs. Now, these 2x14s were really long and they were taking up a ton of room in my shop. So before I started doing anything, I decided to roughly cut them to length so that I could stack them out of the way and actually have some room to work. And I will say they are very heavy. Whew. After I got those moved out of the way, it was time to start looking at these 3x4s. Now, if you've ever worked with reclaimed Douglas fir before, especially posts like this, you might have run into a little invasive species called powder post beetles. These are these little bugs that they like to get into the posts and essentially turn them into powder. That's why they're called powder posts. And the real bummer is their entrance hole is super tiny and then they kind of make a whole community inside the post. So you can't really tell how bad the damage is until you start milling down the lumber. Sure enough, I quickly found some powder post evidence. I got out my air compressor gun, started spraying it out to see how bad the damage was. And in a few of the pieces, as you can see, it was beyond repair. So we're just gonna have to chuck these ones on the burn pile because you can't really do a lot with that. Thankfully, I was able to find 4 pretty good posts without that much damage. There were some bad sections, but not like that nasty one. It's also important to note that if you find evidence of powder post beetles, you should try and figure out if they're still actively alive in the wood, because you don't want to build a whole piece of furniture just to find out there's still bugs living inside the leg and then they eat their way out. I haven't really found a great way to do this except mill all your lumber up and just look for bugs. If you don't see any bugs in the whole milling process, chances are they're gone. If you start to find little white grubs, then, well, they're probably still there. Thankfully, not a bug was found. I got everything jointed and planed, and then I tried to cut out the bad sections. Then I cut my table legs to length. Isn't it crazy that that is the size of a table leg? Every time I build a table, I'm like, there's no way, that's way too short. But then I get the whole table built and somehow it's right. Now, I kind of thought just rectangular legs would be a little boring. I wanted something a little fancier, so I pulled out this rockler tapering jig and I decided to add a nice taper to 2 sides of my leg. So because my leg is longer on one side and shorter on another, it's going to have more of a steep taper on one side and then more of a shallow taper on the other side. So I basically just drew a line at a diagonal that I wanted my taper to be. I just kind of made something up. I figured I'd slope the entire thing down to about 1.5 inches. Once I cut all the tapers on that kind of steeper side, it was time to do the shallow pass. Now, because I want my tapers to kind of alternate and face towards each other, you can't cut all 4 legs exactly the same way. You have to do 2 one way and then flip it around and do 2 the opposite way. Unfortunately, on the longer side of my legs, my table saw blade wouldn't go high enough, so I could only do part way through the leg for my initial cut. but that's all right. It gave me a good guide. I pulled out a block plane and I just knocked that little chunk down by hand. Took a couple minutes and boom, it matches everything else. I know this whole tapering jig looks a little sketchy on camera, but there's a stop behind the legs so that it can't shoot backwards, and it's actually pretty safe. I mean, just hold on tight and make sure your fingers aren't in the way. You're gonna be fine. Pretty soon I had all 4 of my legs tapered. I grabbed the air compressor again. I blew out the holes for like the 16th time. At this point I had milled quite a bit of material off, and as you can see, there are a lot of holes, but it was too late to turn back now. I decided to fill them using some thickened epoxy, Thixo to be exact, from Total Boat. Now let me go on a little bit of a rant for just a second. Why more people aren't using Thixo to fill their voids, I don't know. Everyone reaches for the 2-part epoxy, which is runny, it runs all over the place, it takes longer to dry, and in my opinion, it's harder to work with. You got bubbles, you gotta have a heat gun to pull the bubbles out. When it dries, it shrinks. Just mix up some thickened epoxy. It basically creates a paste that you can spread into the holes. It's gonna stay where you put it, so it's not gonna run all over your workbench. And best of all, there's no bubbles to deal with. It doesn't shrink, and because it's not so thin, it doesn't seep into the pores of your wood, which means it's relatively easy to sand off without having your grain all filled in with epoxy that's going to show up when you put finish on your piece. Anyways, I guess the point of this rant is if you just have some small holes like this to fill and you're not pouring like in between 2 giant live edge slabs, thickened epoxy is the way to go. Oh, and the way I made it black was using some of Total Boat's pigment. I just put a little bit in there and boom, black. Once all of my legs were thoroughly filled, I set those aside so they could dry. That's going to take a few hours, and I decided to start working on my apron pieces that will connect my 4 legs together. Now, because this is true 2x material, I obviously didn't need the pieces that thick for the apron. So to maximize the amount of wood I got out of each individual piece, I decided to rip it right down the middle. I could have done this on the bandsaw, but the table saw was much quicker. I just cut partway through, flipped it around, cut through again, and look at that. 2 pieces now become 1. Wait, that was backwards. Darn it, 1 piece becomes 2. I'm not putting things back together here. Anyways, after I got them cut in half, went over to the planer, planed them down, got them nice and smooth, and then I thought they were a little plain looking, so I wanted to fancy them up a bit. So I cut another thin strip that I thought would look cool if I glued it onto one side of the apron piece, kind of like this. But then I thought the squareness of that piece just looked a little rough. So I went over to the router table with a 1/4 inch roundover bit from Bits and Bits, link in the video description, and I rounded over both sides of that little trim piece. Now when I slap it on the bottom like this, I realize I just said when I slap it on the bottom, and I know how that sounds, but I meant when I put the trim piece onto the bottom of the apron piece. You know what I meant. It looks cool. Now there was a moment where I thought about using a zillion clamps and glue to clamp it on there and then waiting for the glue to dry, and then I thought, this is a rustic reclaimed table. I'm just going to use some glue and tack that strip right on there. Plus, with the orientation of the apron piece, it's going to be on the bottom of the apron, so nobody's ever going to see these nail holes unless they get on their back and crawl under the table. And if people are coming over to your house and getting on their back and crawling under your table, those are weird people, and you probably shouldn't invite them over to dinner anymore. Once my thickened epoxy was dry, I could finally sand down these legs and see what we are working with. Now, like I mentioned, because it is thickened epoxy, it doesn't seep into the pores of the wood as much as a thinned 2-part epoxy. So it didn't take long with just 120 grit on my sander to sand everything down, leaving just all those bug holes filled. It looks a little funny now because it's quite a contrast between the dark bug holes and the light fur, but I think once I get finish on this, it won't look too bad. I actually kind of like it. Gives it a little age and character. And if there were bugs living in there, hopefully they choked on some of that epoxy and are dead now. Next, it was time to start hooking my table legs to my apron pieces. So I cut all my pieces down to the right size, and I had to figure out how to join them together. Now, naturally, I decided to use my domino joiner. Normally, I would just draw some lines connecting the apron to the leg, but because of that little lip, I can't rest the domino joiner on the front for a reference surface, which means I'm going to have to use the domino joiner on the back of the apron piece, but the front of the leg. So to make sure everything lined up exactly how it should, I'm going to have to mark each piece in the exact same place, if that makes any sense. So to do this, I just used a series of setup blocks to ensure that all my marks, no matter what piece they were on, would all line up in the same place. I think my apron was 4 inches, so I used 1.25 inches on the bottom, and then I used 2 3/4 inches on the top. Something like that. Anyways, that gave me pretty evenly spaced out lines to put 2 dominoes connecting my apron to my table leg. Like this. Once I had everything marked out, little zip, little zap, little zoop, easy squeezy lemon peasy, or something like that. Then it was time to pull out the domino joiner and do one of my favorite things, the patented hip thrust. You just put 2 hands on the front of the domino, hold it securely, and thrust. I'm telling you, I know you guys make fun of me all the time for the patented hip thrust, but there's really no other way. If you're looking for dialed-in accuracy, the hip thrust might be for you. Pretty soon I had all my apron pieces mortised out, and then I moved on to the legs. I got all those mortised out, and then the only thing left to do was just to hook everything together. Now whenever I'm doing a 4-legged table like this, and before you're like, what kind of table doesn't have 4 legs? Well, there's lots. A trestle style table doesn't have 4 legs. A pedestal table doesn't have 4 legs. I mean, if I'm doing apron pieces connecting 4 legs together, I like to do the 2 ends first because they're small and manageable. I get those glued up in clamps, let them dry. Once those are dry, then I hook those 2 ends together. When you're working by yourself, this is much easier than trying to hook all 4 apron pieces on at the same time. You're rushing around, glue's drying up, things aren't fitting together, squeeze outs dropping on the floor, you're freaking out, screaming, sweating, can't find your clamp. Just nobody wants to do that. So just take it easy, glue up the ends, and then when those are dry, move on to hooking everything together. You'll be a much happier person. Thankfully, this is a YouTube video, so we don't have to wait around for glue to dry. My 2 ends dried up, I took them out of clamps, and then I did exactly what I said, and I hooked the rest of the apron pieces together. This is always tricky because you want plenty of glue around those dominoes, but you don't want a ton of squeeze out, and for some reason, I never get it right. I always think I'm not putting too much glue on there, but I always get a ton of squeeze out, and then I gotta clean it off. But in my opinion, too much squeeze out is better than no squeeze out, because then you're just left wondering, did I put enough glue in that joint? And you'll never know until your table falls apart, and well, that's a pretty good sign you needed just a little more glue. In no time, I had my 2 ends now connected by those longer apron pieces, so very carefully I lowered the table to the floor, and then I put some clamps on it. Lucky for me, I have some pretty long bar clamps. So just 2 clamps, one on either side with some little scrap pieces of wood on there so I don't mar up the table. And now we just gotta sit around and wait for this glue to dry. This video is sponsored by our good friends over at Policy Genius. Now, I know life insurance isn't the most exciting topic, but when I think back on my life and how hard I've worked to grow and build a business that financially supports my family, the thought of something happening to me and leaving them in the lurch just is terrifying. That's why I love the idea of finding a good life insurance policy to know that my family is going to be taken care of should the worst happen. And the cool thing about Policy Genius is they make it so incredibly easy to find the policy that's right for you. If you don't believe me, just check this out. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Your work life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Policy Genius gives you unbiased advice from a licensed expert support team. They have no incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. That's probably why they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot, because they really are the smarter way to buy life insurance. Now at this point, you're probably like, wow, that was incredibly easy, but where do I go? What do I do? How do I sign up? Well, that part's even easier than what I just told you. Just do this. Check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/bourbonmoth or click the link in the description to get multiple life insurance quotes for free and see how much you can save. Why not check another thing off your to-do list and find a great life insurance policy to make sure your family is protected? Huge thanks to Policy Genius for sponsoring this video. While you were busy learning about life insurance, this glue was busy doing its thing and drying. So I took the clamps off of the table base, and then I took some measurements for our internal supports. Whenever I'm building tables that are this sort of style, I like to throw some internal support pieces in there. It just helps keep the base nice and square, gives you some more surfaces to mount the top to the base from. You have options. So I cut 2 pieces to length, and then I was gonna pocket hole them inside the whole thing so you couldn't see any joinery. And I thought to myself, this is supposed to be kind of a rustic looking table. Maybe the key here is not to hide the joinery, but to make it a feature. So I opted to use screws from the outside and then plug them so that it looks like I used dowel pins, even though I didn't because I'm a lazy woodworker and that would have taken too long. It actually wouldn't have taken any longer. I just would have had to drill a deeper hole, but I used screws. And then to hide the evidence, I went over to the drill press, used one of these CMT Tools plug cutters that are available on my website, bourbonmoth.com, and I cut a bunch of plugs out of a scrap piece of fur from one of my off-cut apron pieces. Went over to the bandsaw, cut those plugs free, and then with a little glue and a framing hammer, my preferred tool of choice for fine woodworking, I hammered those plugs in and covered up my screws. Now, some people will tell you you need to wait for all the glue to dry before you flush cut your plugs. But I think those people just don't want to have fun, because nothing is more fun than cutting them right away because you're impatient and you want to spend time cleaning glue off your flush cut saw. Anyways, I flush cut all the plugs, sanded them down, and the table base was essentially completely constructed at this point, and we could start working on the top. Now, I thought the true 2x thickness of this reclaimed fir was just too thick for a top. It just didn't look right. The proportions were all wrong. So I took some longer pieces, I ran them through the planer, I brought them down to just about exactly 1 inch thick, and I just thought that looked much nicer. You know, sometimes things are too beefy. Like my cousin, Jeremy. You gotta lose weight, man. You just gotta do it. I'm just kidding. I don't have a cousin named Jeremy. And if I did, I wouldn't body shame him on a YouTube video. I'm not a monster. Anyways, once I was happy with the thickness of my pieces, I trimmed them down a little bit so that there was just about 1.5 inch overhang on both sides. And I was just about ready to move on to the next step in the building process when my wife decided that she wanted to come out and take a little test drive, which is a-okay with me. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do if she says she's not happy with it, because it's practically built at this point, but thankfully she loved it, so I could continue. Next, I pulled my boards off. I gave them a nice sanding on the edge, and then I just decided it was too square. I already rounded over some other things. I'm just going to soften the edges of my boards just a little bit. So I chalked up the 1/4 inch roundover bit in my little palm router, rounded over both sides of all my pieces, sanded them down really nice, and I think we're ready to finish this thing.
We have this table completely built. I'm really liking the way that it's looking. I know I scraped a lot of that original patina off, but I just think it was necessary to get the shape and everything smooth. Now, the problem with reclaimed Douglas fir, although it looks really cool, is that it wants to turn orange. So here's a little sample piece that I put Rubio Monocoat Pure on, and as you can see, the second that you put that oil on there, it just brings out this really orange tint. It does this way worse with reclaimed fir. I don't know if there's something with the age and the sun exposure, but it's a problem unless you're okay with this color. Thankfully, the good folks over at Rubio Monocoat make this awesome product called pre-aging. Now, I've used this before. I used this on the big white oak hutch that we did. It gave it a really cool kind of aged look. I did a little experimenting on another piece. So this is the same exact material. The only difference is I put the pre-aging on this first, and then I put the Rubio Pure over the top. And as you can see, just adding that pre-aging to the wood first really helps limit the amount of oranginess that comes through. So, before we oil this down with the regular Rubio, we're gonna pre-age the entire thing. Now, this stuff could not be easier to apply. I'm gonna put it in a spray bottle. You literally just make sure the entire surface gets evenly coated, is really good and wet, and then you let it dry for 24 hours. It kind of reacts over time, changes the color a little bit, and then once it's completely dry, we'll come back and we'll put our final coat of Rubio on. So, that's what I'm gonna do right now.
They say you should eat an elephant one bite at a time, and I think you should finish a table one leg at a time. Maybe that's how you should eat an elephant, actually, because when you think about it, if you just eat one leg at a time, well, by the time you're done with the legs, all you got left is the body. They should change how they say that. Anyways, I started putting the pre-aging onto the table. Now, you could just dip a rag into the pre-aging and wipe it all down. That would work just fine. I thought it would be a little faster if I loaded up a spray bottle. I just spritzed the entire thing, and then Craig could kind of walk around and be on drip control. So that's what we did. And it worked really well. The spray bottle kind of coated it up really quick. We made sure there were no drips. Everything was nicely saturated, wiped it off, and then you just gotta sit and wait. Magically, over the course of a few hours, it will dry, and as it dries, it kind of reacts with the wood, and as you can see, it turns this nice light gray color. Ooh, kind of looks like an elephant.
Our pre-aging is done. We've let it dry for 24 hours. As you can see, it gives it this kind of nice gray color. Now, in the past, I've put this on there and just used this as the finish, which is risky because it doesn't add any protection at all. They also have multiple colors in their pre-aging. This is authentic number 2. I'll put a link in the video description, but there's a bunch of other colors you can play around with. Since this is a dining room table, I do want it to have some protection, so we're gonna put an oil over the top. But now we gotta figure out what color oil we want to do. I've been experimenting with a few different oil options. This one is Rubio Mist. I think it's a little too light. This is Rubio Pure, which I like. It just warms it up a little bit. The thing I really love about Rubio, though, is that you can mix and match colors to get exactly what you want. So this is my favorite because it just doesn't do a whole lot to the color. This is a mixture of Rubio Pure and just a little bit of Rubio Castle Brown. So I think that's what we're gonna go with. I'm gonna mix up a bunch of this We're gonna get this thing slathered up.
Now, before anyone goes down to the comment section to say, holy cow, how much are you making? That's like enough to do 8 tables. I know, I made a lot extra because I really liked the color and I figure I'll use it for other stuff. Plus, if I ever want to touch up the table, I got some in a can in my shop. The thing I didn't do was add hardener to all of that Rubio because that would have wasted it. Because once you add the hardener, well, it's only good for like 4 hours. So I mixed up a little bit with the hardener, that color, and then Craig started on one end, I started on the other. I was like, dude, let's meet in the middle. It didn't really work out that way. We actually kind of met on the side, and then I had to go back and redo some of the stuff that he missed. He was just really focused. But we got it done. As you can see, it's got that nice brown color, no oranginess at all. Although on camera, I could see how you think it might look a little orangey in places, but I promise you that's just the iPhone doing its weird thing. In person, it is just a nice brown color. Once we got the entire table base done, we moved on to the top. And then, that evening, I went out to hook everything together. Now, when I do reclaimed tables, I like to do the top in separate boards. I just think it adds to that kind of reclaimed rustic feel. But the trick is, how do you hook those boards together so they don't flop all over the place? And I just crawl underneath. I cut a board almost exactly the width in between my 2 apron pieces, and then I screw it to each individual board to lock them into place. And then because it's tight in between that apron, it can't move left to right. And because I put one on either side, it can't move forward and backwards, which essentially means you don't have to hook the tabletop to the base. You can just leave it so that you can remove it for easy carrying around.
I gotta say, as much as I hate building with reclaimed fir when I am actually doing the building process and the headaches and the bug holes and the splinters, when it's all said and done, it turns out pretty nice. I mean, for a new table that looks old, this one, well, it does the job. It's not a giant table. It's gonna fit the space perfect though. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that video. You learned some things. The Rubio Monocoat pre-aging followed by the custom mixed oil color. Really just, I love how this one turned out. Check the link in the descriptions. There's links to all those Rubio products down there. There's a link to our Bourbon blade, which is on sale right now on the website. You can get it right when you order it. You don't have to wait, which is great. And there's a link to our Patreon. You should sign up. There's a ton of behind the scenes footage, and we do a weekly live stream. So if you want to ask questions directly to me in real time every week, well, go sign up for our Patreon. Okay, I just gotta get this thing all the way over to the cabin.